All right, boys and girls, we're going to finish up Unit 3, Note 6. This is Part 2 of Fighting the War. We left off talking about Gettysburg, the three-day battle, which is the turning point. It's a Union victory. The South never again invades the North on Union soil, so none of the remaining Civil War battles will be fought in Northern territory. And you wrote down that this is the turning point. The South never invaded the North again. We're going to take a look at the Gettysburg Address. November 19th of 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to speak to a crowd gathered to honor the thousands of men who had been buried in a new cemetery. The chief speaker at the event was Edward Everett. His dedication speech went on for nearly 2 hours. So people were really surprised when the President of the United States gets up and he gives his dedication speech in less than 3 minutes. Ironically, in his speech, Lincoln stated, "The world will little know nor long remember what we say here." But this speech, the Gettysburg Address, becomes one of the most famous presidential speeches of all time. The Gettysburg Address was meant to dedicate the cemetery for the fallen soldiers of the battlefield at Gettysburg, but Lincoln also encouraged Americans to continue to be dedicated to protecting the ideals of freedom, those same ideals that our nation was founded upon. Would you please write down that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was a dedication speech in honor of fallen Union soldiers. This happened September of 1863. Okay, just a couple of months after the Battle of Gettysburg took place, which was July, the first couple days of July. So on the timeline on the other side of your paper, would you please write down that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address in 1863. I wish you could hear it through the speakers at this point, but you'll have to switch out to view it on this this video, which I will also put up in our Google Classroom. So next we're going to look at Sherman's March to the Sea. Okay. After Gettysburg, ironically at the same time as Gettysburg was being fought, General Grant was finishing up a very big battle in Tennessee. And because of his tenacity with that battle and his determination, Lincoln actually appoints him to be the commander of the Union Army. Okay, in May of 1864, under the orders of the new Union General Ulysses S. Grant, the Union Army waged what we call total war through the South. Grant chose William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the destructive campaign through Georgia from Atlanta to the coastal city of Savannah. After burning Atlanta, Sherman promised to make Georgia howl by purposefully destroying everything of value as he led Union troops on a march to the sea. They trampled and burned fields, they stripped houses of the valuables, they killed any animals that they could not use to feed the Union Army, and they destroyed everything useful within a 60-mile-wide path. In December of 1864, Sherman captured Savannah, Georgia. From there, he and the Union troops marched north, and they joined General Grant and his forces together. They battered the city, the Confederate capital city of Richmond, Virginia. So for your notes, please write down in the Savannah campaign that it was General Sherman. They waged total war through the state of Georgia. And that leads us to Richmond, Virginia, the battle at Richmond. Okay. For 9 months, Grant's forces battered Lee's army at Petersburg outside of Richmond, Virginia. This is actually where some of the first uses of trench warfare come into play, because they kind of dig down in and they stay there for 9 months. Okay, on April 1st, 1865, Union forces finally broke through the Confederate lines to capture the city of Petersburg, and from there it was pretty much all over for Richmond. Okay. Grant marched his troops into the Confederate capital city, and 2 days later, Union troops marched into the city and demolished it. So if you saw that, there's the city of Richmond, Virginia, before Union forces broke through the lines. And there it is after. General Lee realized that his troops were surrounded by Grant's forces. He told his officers there was nothing more to do but to find Grant and surrender. There's nothing left for me to do but go see General Grant. I would rather die 1,000 deaths, said General Lee. So that brings us to this building, this little house on this property. This is Appomattox Courthouse. It's not a courthouse, it is a civilian home. In fact, ironically, it's a civilian who we've actually met earlier in part 1 of these notes. Appomattox Courthouse is a little small town outside of Richmond, Virginia. General Lee sent soldiers to find a location where he could meet General Grant for his formal surrender. Ironically, the first man they came upon agreed to let the generals meet at his home in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. This man's name is Wilmer McLean. Remember, he's also the guy whose farmland was used for both the first and second Battle of Bull Run. So he said, the war started in my front yard and ended in my parlor. April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, officially ending the U.S. Civil War. General Grant's terms of surrender were very generous. They allowed the Southern soldiers to return to their homes peacefully. They even let them keep their firearms, which is kind of ironic, and they sent them with their own horses back. So in your notes, would you please write down that Appomattox Courthouse is where the war ended, when General Lee surrendered to General Grant. The North was victorious. And in your notes on the back side for the timeline, April 9th, 1865, this is when the South surrendered at Appomattox, and it was the end of the war. All right, so make sure that you've done this part of the Gettysburg Address, and you've got your timeline filled in, and your notes are all filled in. Okay, thank you for listening.